Hello and welcome everyone. So in this video I'm going to talk about information and signaling, and in particular I'm going to reinforce this using an example from Pirates. And so this is actually kind of a cool example, and the paper that I'm kind of drawing on is from, it appeared in JBO, so it is the economics of infamous pirate practices. And the basic idea is we want to sort of explore economic behavior, and we want to kind of use economic theory to sort of understand, explain, and then predict. And I'm going to be able to talk about some cool applications here, in particular thinking about strategy, thinking about signaling theory, and thinking about reputation. And I really like teaching this example because I think this is one of the most sort of salient, clear examples of signaling. Like sometimes it's really difficult to understand what signaling theory is doing. I think this is a clear example that kind of helps us in this kind of interesting context. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to apply economic theory to analyze the seemingly irrational behavior of criminals and criminal organization, in particular pirates. And so what this is doing is this is focusing on this particular time period, thinking about late 17th and early 18th century. And we're going to use theory to explore, firstly, the logic of displaying the Jolly Roger pirate flag, and then secondly, the rationality of exhibiting maniacal displays of fiendishness and violence, right? And so the idea is actually arguing how this was beneficial to pirates and actually led possibly to more peaceful encounters, oddly enough. So anyway, so the sources are historical in nature. This is like using the original paper was looking back and looking at some of these historical sources to find out, firstly, what had people written as accounts about pirates, both from pirates themselves, from people that had experiences with them, from journalists, and so on and so forth. So, for instance, we're thinking about the area from Bahamas, Europe, North America, on Cuba, Haiti, Madagascar. So think about the pirate round as the geographic area. And the sources, well, some of them are reports written by contemporaries. There's an account from a surgeon on a vessel. There's court records from pirate trials, newspaper articles, and correspondence. And so this is kind of really interesting, especially in the context of then applying economic theory to make sense out of this. I really like this. This is sort of like a really brilliant example of how you can use economic theory to make sense out of historical events. And that's something that I find really compelling and I try to do myself. So anyway, so from the passage from the paper, the economist's job is to take the fragmentary, often indirect, historical data available, put them together using the glue of economic logic, filling in the holes that those data create with that logic along the way to create a fuller and more informative historical picture than the data alone present. Matter of fact, this should actually be your strategy for the paper that you'll develop in the course, which is thinking about, you've got something interesting you want to explore, you've got a perspective and something to say, and you want to try to use economic logic, or it's valid to use some ethical theory, basically to fill in the holes and to be able to piece together the picture that you want to paint for us. And that's the idea here. And here I think there's a brilliant application of economic theory. Hopefully you enjoy it and appreciate it too. All right, so thinking about the scenario, well, pirates want to maximize their profits, or at least we can model pirates as profit maximizers. They also want to minimize their costs, right? So pirate ships, in terms of like how they are outfitted, typically were a lot stronger than the victim ships, actually by a factor of 3 or more. They had more fighters, they had better guns, and they would reinvest in these sorts of things, so in better capability to wage battle against other ships that they'd be trying to overtake. The merchant ship simply wasn't going to often be able to fight off a pirate ship, but it might be able to inflict damage, right? There could be costs in terms of like damage, injury, and death, all of which making it more difficult for pirates to be pirates in the future. All right, so interestingly, as you'd expect, there's this cost associated with battling for the potential prize, right? The prize itself is important, right? So that you have this value from the ship that you'd be able to extract, but then the costs for attacking a particular ship might be great. And think about the economic analysis. Well, you compare the benefits to the costs of taking over a particular vessel, and really anything you can do to diminish those costs as much as possible, make it more attractive for pirates. Right, so what's the problem? Well, deaths or injury diminish the ability to capture future prizes. So they're caring about the future. And, if you try to overtake this ship today, maybe you get it, maybe you don't. But if there's sufficient damage, this could affect your ability to be pirates in the future. So that's not good if you're a pirate. Damage to pirate ships themselves reduce their effectiveness at chasing and capturing future prizes, and actually also makes you a little bit more vulnerable to authorities. And so you don't want to take on damage, because part of what the pirates were sort of relying on, having relatively fast maneuverable ships that also could overpower vessels with their firepower. So anyway, a battle could damage the prize, could damage the value of what pirates were trying to seize, as damaged ships were far less useful, right? Sometimes you might overtake a ship and then turn that into a pirate ship if it was a good enough one. Or if you lose part of the treasure that you're trying to extract in the battle, then that diminishes the benefits as well. All right, so what's the pirate solution? Well, the pirates want to overwhelm their victims without violence, right? You want to overwhelm the victims without violence, because it's the violence that causes the cost to both the thing you're trying to seize as well as your future ability to be a pirate. So the pirates want to come up with a strategy that allows them to take prizes without this sort of extensive battle. The first thing, part one, is promising to kill sailors who resist them. And then second, part two, promise to show mercy to sailors who surrendered peacefully. Right? So what this does is it raises the cost of resistance, at the same time raising the benefits of surrender, all with the goal of allowing nonviolent capture. Because if all potential victims adhere to this strategy, then they'll just surrender and you'll be able to seize the ship costlessly, essentially. All right, but in order for this strategy to be effective, pirates need to be able to credibly commit to the surrender or die policy. Right? It's got to be the case that the victim ship actually believes the pirates are going to make good on this promise, or this perceived promise. Otherwise, it undermines the policy in the first place. Right. The problem is actually following through on the promise to slaughter the resistant merchants after subduing them was costly, because, well, the sailors might fight back as you'd expect and inflict more costs, and this could end up involving injuries or deaths to at least some of the pirates, which is costly and they want to avoid. Also, once you've seized the ship and you've got the prize, you've got the crew under control, there's no immediate benefits to killing and to carrying through the surrender or die policy, assuming like they've resisted, you've overcome the resistance, and then now you've got to decide what to do with the victims. Well, there's no short-term benefits to killing them. That's costly and no benefit. And that's true, actually, whether the ship was captured via battle or not. All the benefits are future benefits as a result of reinforcing belief in this policy. So here's how we'd model this as a game. And I want to stop here also as viewing this as like a really good kind of clear example of economic theory, in this case using game theory to model this interesting situation. And I hope you take inspiration or motivation to do something similar in your own paper. All right, so we can model this as a game with merchants moving first and then pirates moving second. So merchants are going to decide, once we're starting in the encounter, merchants are going to decide whether to surrender or to resist. If merchants surrender, we'll say their payoffs are 1, pirates' payoffs are 3. If they resist, pirates have observed that resistance, hence their information set follows the movement by merchants to resist, and now pirates decide whether to spare or to kill. If the pirates spare, then merchants get 2. That's good for them. If the pirates kill, merchants get -1. That's bad for them. And what are the pirates' payoffs? Well, 2 if they spare and 0 if they kill, right? And so the problem here is, as we're analyzing this game, think about this from the backward induction solution. We go to the end of the game. We think about what pirates want to do once they're actually called upon to play. And we see, oh, well, once we're called upon to play, we actually get a higher payoff if we spare than if we kill. The 2 is bigger than 0. So if we are always going to spare as pirates, merchants are going to look forward in the game and say, oh, they're not going to kill us because this leads to a payoff of 0 for them. They're going to want this payoff of 2, which means if we resist, we get 2, but if we surrender, we only get 1. Well, let's resist and then be spared. So the problem is this leads to a situation where there's an incredible commitment. When there's an incredible commitment, then we end up with this as the subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, as the backward induction solution. This is not what the pirates want. Pirates don't want the merchants to resist, and then because the resistance is what's costly. All right, so the problem is pirates have a commitment problem. The game has a unique subgame perfect Nash equilibrium to resist and then spare, because when pirates actually are called upon to choose, it's more beneficial, it's sequentially rational for them to spare rather than kill. That's bad, because then every merchant figures this out, just as we have, and then will always just violently resist, which maybe raises the possibility that they might be successful, also leads the merchants to the payoff of 2 rather than 1, right? Okay, so this inflicts damage on the pirates. That's bad. So what do the pirates do? Well, they've got a solution. To overcome the commitment problem, they want to invoke reputation. So if pirates have many possible victims who are then observing the pirates' past actions, the pirates have this sort of long-run payoff function to maximize. What they're trying to do is develop this reputation of mercilessness, whether deserved or not, toward resistors, because they want to be able to deter future merchants from resisting. That's the idea. All right, so a similar reputation consideration reinforces the promise to leave compliant merchants unharmed. Right? So it's not just that they want a reputation for violence, they also want a reputation for mercy. Because murdering a compliant crew is costly, because then there's the cost of actually like engaging in this violence. Also, there's no offsetting reputational benefit. It actually ruins the reputation, because if the crew believes that they're going to be murdered either way, then they're going to fight back. And so if merchants expect pirates to murder them, they have an incentive to resist. Instead, what you want to do is preserve the incentive for the merchants to peacefully surrender, right? So there's strong incentives not to kill the surrendering crew. So this is, okay, we've got this interesting story that I'm telling you from the perspective of economic theory. This paper shows that this actually matches the theoretical prediction, matches the historical account. And so we can actually model this a little bit more formally. And so we can make this in a situation where this process right here reinforces a slightly different game. This commitment mechanism allows to move to a different equilibrium. So we'll model this differently. We'll model this with merchants, again, moving first, choosing to resist or surrender. Pirates are going to move second and then choose to spare or kill. So now I'm going to assign payoffs. Let me show you the game first. So this is going to be the game. Merchants can surrender or resist. Pirates can spare or can kill. Pirates can spare or can kill. Right? Pirates have the choice to spare or kill regardless of what the merchants have done. And merchants are choosing either to surrender or resist. We see these odd payoffs here. Let me talk about these in a second. What's really important is we want to reflect the relative payoffs, right? So we want merchants to get their highest payoff when resisting and not punished for doing so. We want merchants to get a smaller payoff if it surrenders but spared. We get a lower payoff to merchants if they resist and are punished, and they get the lowest possible payoff if they surrendered but are killed anyway, right? Okay, so we're going to rank these payoffs in order, and then we need our payoffs for pirates. They get their largest payoff when the merchants surrender and are not killed. Pirates get a smaller payoff if the merchant surrenders but's killed anyway, because that's costly to the pirates. Pirates get a lower payoff if the merchants resist but then are killed by the pirates, and pirates' lowest possible payoff is if merchants resist and pirates don't kill them, because that affects the future payoffs. All right, so now we've ranked the payoffs here. That gives us this game. I know this is hard to look at, and so what we'll do is we'll just replace this with numbers. Okay, so these numbers are just these are just meant to reflect the ranking, right? So we wanted a P to be big, alpha P to be bigger than beta P to be bigger than theta P to be bigger than sigma P. So we've got that here. Okay, so now we've got the numbers used to rank the outcomes. This will help us interpret this game a little bit better. And now as we're doing the backward induction solution to see where we think this game will end up, well, if merchants resist, what are pirates going to want to do? Pirates could kill and receive a 2, or they could spare and receive a 1. So after resisting, pirates are going to want to kill. So we'll actually could shade down over this portion. What about after surrendering? Pirates could kill and receive a 3, or could spare and receive a 4. Oh, well, 4 is bigger than 3, so we'll say after surrender, pirates are going to spare. After resist, pirates are going to kill. So we're looking down the external branches of this tree. Well, if we can figure that out, and the merchants can probably figure that out as well, merchants are going to look between a 3 and a 2, and they're going to say, oh, well, I'd rather not be killed and get a 2. I'm going to surrender and be spared and get a 3. And so this is going to tilt us towards the outcome, the equilibrium, where merchants always surrender and pirates always spare them. Right? So this game has a unique subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, just as the one we just found. Merchants surrender, pirates spare their lives. It turns out this surrender or die policy maximizes the piratical profits, right? What's happened is if you can spread this policy through word of mouth and everybody's expecting that this is how the interaction is going to go, then we'll have a situation where merchants are going to always surrender, pirates will always spare them, but pirates are always going to get the full prize. Interestingly, we'd expect media coverage was helpful here, helping pirates cultivate and then cash in on this reputation. And that's, again, reinforced by the historical records that were part of the paper. Okay, so that gets us an interesting motivation for this story and for building this reputation, and speaking to the fact that this could be effective for pirates maximizing their profits. So then the question is, well, what about signaling theory? Why would pirates fly the Jolly Roger? So it turns out we can think about this from the standpoint of the message contained by the Jolly Roger, right? So signaling theory tells us when there's multiple types of agents whose identities are not directly observable, but are nevertheless important in shaping the other third party's decisions about how to act, agents can use costly signals to distinguish themselves, right? So it turns out we had two types of belligerent mariners, right? So there's pirates, but then there's also this Guarda Costa. The government commissioned vessels intended to protect the Spanish territory and trade routes, right? So the Coast Guard is supposed to be restricted to taking ships, illicit traders, near the coast that they are supposed to be protecting, right? So there's this protectionist. You're not supposed to be bringing in, engaging in illicit trade, and if you didn't have the authority to be trading or entering that port, then Coast Guard would seize these ships and then, discourage future trade. So that's how it's supposed to work, but in reality, they often wandered into these deeper waters, finding any ships that they could justify seizing. As you might imagine, we have actually a principal agent problem here, where the Coast Guard had a little bit different incentive than the Spanish government. So even so, the government-sanctioned patrols were constrained in the viciousness they were able to show, at least in principle. Well, because there's this, so if you're acting under the guise of the law, then there's a certain level that you've got to uphold before all of a sudden you're becoming a criminal yourself. So, all right, if the merchant, however, believes it was under attack from the Coast Guard, it'd have a greater incentive to resist because of this constraint in violence that the restraint the Coast Guard would have to show. This, if true, would undermine the surrender or die strategy because merchants could mistake Coast Guard for pirates. So pirates needed a signal that allowed them to benefit from their reputation. Interestingly, if we believe this story, rather than an emblem of bloodthirsty pirates, the Jolly Roger reflected pirates' desire to avoid violent conflict with prey. So here's the story, and here kind of developing this logic. Right, so seafaring was dangerous. Here's the origin story for the Jolly Roger. Seafaring is dangerous. Many sailors died from accident, disease, violence, and a common way to denote the death in ships' records was a small skull and bones next to their name. So former merchants and Navy sailors then adopted this symbol of death to signal their identity as pirates. Right, so they adopted the skull and bones as their signal that they were pirates. And so I've got my pirate hat here, which I've got specially prepared, actually not for this lecture, but for the race that I'm hoping to do on Saturday. So this hat, though it's appropriate for our Jolly Roger here, this is actually for Tommy Ribs. So Tommy Ribs is an ultra runner. If you've been on like a Nordic track or like iFit treadmill, you might see Tommy Ribs running and leading some of the workouts. Tommy Ribs has lung cancer, recently discovered over the summer. Initially, somewhat kind of mistaken for COVID. So just a terribly sad story. Anyway, so Kraft is selling Run with Ribs shirts and then the hat. And so I've got the hat, got the shirt. I had the shirt already, so for the marathon that I did, here's me, my Run with Ribs shirt, and then I don't know, at the end, I don't know my facial expression. I think here I am, like trying not to break out laughing because this is my second marathon of the weekend, and the announcer was saying something about how I was coming in and I was not leaving anything on the course, when in reality I was trying to finish, right? So like typically I'd finish a lot faster, but I was doing absolutely nothing to get to, putting in absolutely no effort to get to the finish line any quicker than I was presently moving. And so anyway, so I'll be wearing the Jolly Roger Team Ribs hat. Team Ribs. It's gonna be backwards for the race on Saturday. Anyway, right. By communicating pirates to merchants, the Jolly Roger helped the victims understand it was pirates, right? Help pirates distinguish themselves in the minds of the merchants from Coast Guard. So merchants knew that resisting would be costly if it was pirates that were attacking them, as opposed to the Coast Guard, which should be more restrained. The problem is, for the Jolly Roger to work, we'd actually need what's called a separating equilibrium, right? So merchants need to be able to perfectly infer whether the attackers were pirates or not, just based on whether they saw the Jolly Roger. So this must be the case that it's cheap for pirates to use the signal, but really costly for the Coast Guard to use the signal. Well, that's interesting. So what actually happened? This is kind of like, it's exactly what you'd expect. This is exactly how you'd expect things to work, right? So firstly, pirates were already outlaws. If they were caught, they were going to be executed, Jolly Roger or not. So it just really didn't matter. However, legitimate belligerents like the Coast Guard weren't outlaws, but hoisting the Jolly Roger would make them outlaws. Also, like, using this to engage in illegal activities would make them outlaws. So carrying the black flag placed them outside the bounds of their legal gray area. So the flag, the Jolly Roger, was more costly for Coast Guards than for pirates. So that being the case, we'd expect this sort of separating equilibrium where the signal's veridical. Meaning, if you see the Jolly Roger, it's more likely than not a pirate. If you don't see a Jolly Roger, it's more likely than not Coast Guard. But here's the brilliant part. Did it work? No, because we're talking about people, right? So we're thinking about individuals. You can think of incentives and how this works. Well, all right. What actually happened was not quite a separating equilibrium. Instead, we got a semi-separating equilibrium. So pirates use the Jolly Rogers, but the Coast Guard sometimes would also, right? So what would happen is, if the Coast Guard had a vessel that they thought that they would believe that they could easily overtake, then they'd raise the Jolly Roger. Otherwise, they'd rely on their legal enforcement status to legitimize the capture. And so they had at their disposal either their official papers or the flag, and then they'd see the potential victim and say, okay, which one is this going to be? Are we put the flag up, or are we going to board with our official papers? And you could see how opportunistic agents would behave in this matter. And that's exactly what we'd expect based on sort of human psychology and behavioral economic and so on and so forth. And sure enough, we have this in this example. Interestingly, thinking about how the Jolly Roger would look, well, there's some variation in the exact appearance. It was interestingly, so the paper goes into all this great detail. Of course, like, some of the flags is a little bit of a trademark, because it's specific pirate bands had the specific reputation that they generated. And so we didn't want people free riding on their trademark, right? Flags were similar enough to signal pirate, different enough to communicate the specific identity of the pirate crews. And then stronger crews would internalize their benefits without weaker crews free riding on their trademark. Because if you're using my trademark, now there's a big problem, right? So it wouldn't be wise to steal a stronger pirate crew's flag. There's relatively few pirates, say like 2,000 or so, and relatively few bases. And so retaliation was possible, if not likely. Here's some examples of different Jolly Roger variants. I don't know exactly what Tommy Rivs has. So it looks a little bit like Blackbeard. Yeah, it looks a little bit like Blackbeard. So Team Rivs. Okay, so Tommy's doing, according to Instagram updates from his brother, Tommy's doing better. Had been in a coma, had been unconscious, and is now kind of responding to chemotherapy, and has been, I guess, talking to family, which is really good news. So anyway, once pirates boarded a surrendered ship, there'd be more work to be done. Pirates had to locate the loot. Victims didn't want to give it up. So it wasn't just a matter of getting on board. Now there's the second portion. So the surrender or die was not as effective at eliminating the difficult to observe resistance, such as hiding valuables, throwing them overboard, or stuff like this. It's really obvious for the easy to observe resistance, but there are subtle things that the merchant crew could do. Therefore, pirates needed to be known as those who would unleash unspeakable violence on those who crossed them. So they needed this reputation concern to prevent the resistance that would be difficult to monitor, essentially. So here's my question. Is it rational to be irrational? Well, the pirate strategy rested on three goals. First, establish their image as those who could easily be pushed over the edge, establish a reputation for going berserk when this occurred, and then advertise this reputation. So pirates wanted to work to cultivate this image amongst those that they interacted with as being on the brink of sanity and uncaring about the law or death. And this is important then to reinforce this fear that would therefore cause merchants not to cross them. Here's a picture of this pirate persona. I think this might have been, if I remember, this is an engraving from General History, Charles Johnson. I think this might have been Blackbeard. Anyway, so pirates achieve the second goal through heinous torture, right? So torture, there's two different types of torture. Torture for information, which would contribute to reputation indirectly. So this would be like potentially immediately profitable if you had believed that the crew had resisted and hid treasure or threw it overboard, right? Might help you uncover hidden treasure, but it was also costly because the victims might fight back immediately, but could contribute to reputation concerns in the future. Torture for reputation, though, contributed to reputation directly. So here this would be torturing a victim who pirates suspected of destroying loot was a investment that prevented future captives from doing so. Right? So if they're trying to get information, well, indirect effect on reputation and maybe an immediate effect on information. But if it's a torture for a reputation scenario, then they're trying to prevent actually future captives from crossing them. This theory of reputation building also predicts that pirates would show mercy towards compliance. And interestingly, there's accounts of pirates' kindness. And so in the historical records, there's stories of pirates being maniacal and heinous. There's also accounts of pirates being surprisingly kind, particularly to those who are compliant. And there's really interesting accounts in the paper and then historical accounts more generally. And this all sort of gets reinforced and helps reinforce our economic analysis of the problem here. All right, so anyway, here we are talking about two closely related economic theories to explain the pirates' infamous practices. Firstly, the theory of signaling. The Jolly Roger flag and signaling theory helps to reinforce some of the practices of pirate behavior. And then the theory of reputation. The public display of madness and heinous torture reinforces reputation. And then these strategies, right, these infamous practices were rationally chosen responses to the conditions that pirates faced. So is it rational to be irrational? Well, maybe it's rational to be perceived as irrational in the case of this reputation that pirates were trying to develop, right? So the idea here is that if we model pirates as profit maximizers, as standard economic agents, we can actually get kind of a lot of mileage for applying signaling theory and then reputation theory. Also, hopefully you take this as a kind of a cool example to kind of illustrate and then make signaling theory a little bit more salient, a little bit more apparent, and then hopefully a little bit more memorable. All right, so this analysis illuminates strategies criminals use to establish their identities, actually the investments that criminals make in developing an identity. It's not restricted to pirates, right? So there's a lot of other interesting organizations. And we could see how they coordinate on these strategies, right? The communication mechanisms criminals use to broadcast and manipulate public images and propagate their reputations leads to higher returns for the criminal bands in the future. And then we also talked about the obstacles criminals confront when dealing with their victims and thinking about the trade-off, the costs and benefits involved, and how behavior might actually be explainable relative to this sort of profit maximizing strategy. Okay, anyway, so I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.